Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Rob Morandi. I'm a first-year student at MIT Sloan, and I'm honored to introduce Eric Joyce and Cam Lawrence, who will be presenting on blending the old and new, what the Florida Panthers do to try and predict future performance at the NHL entry draft. Thank you.
On. Hey, guys. So what Cam and I thought we were going to do is we're going to put up our draft list, and thumbs up if you think he's right slotted, thumbs down. We'll just do crowdsource like the Kings used to do. Honestly, though, no, nothing that we're going to say is revolutionary here today. I think most people in this crowd will take a look out and say, like, no kidding, right? This is what you guys do. But I think this presentation, at least my portion of it, and then we'll get into Cam's portion and how he adds value to our scouting staff, is what we try to do is know ourselves better every day and work smarter. The NHL is a really hard league to predict future performance in my opinion, and I'm biased, and we'll talk about that in a second. But the NHL entry draft, you're taking a kid at age 18. It's the hardest draft of all because you take most of these kids and you don't have control of them for 1, 2, 3, sometimes even 4 years. So how do you predict a kid's where he's going to be in 4 years when you're not controlling certain variables like what he eats or who his friends are or what his gym habits are or study habits or how he studies the game or film work with the coaching staff, etc. So, Cam will get into that, but really, here's our agenda. What we're going to try to do is, what I'll do is define the operating environment. When I say operating environment, what I mean is who goes out and collects this data for us, how they do it, and how we as management know whether or not that data is right, wrong, and different, right? So we have to figure out what our guys collecting the data, what their biases are. So this is our first. This is essentially, when I go to work every day, this is kind of what I deal with, right? So our scouts have 30 years of hockey knowledge, and it's tremendous, and it's great knowledge in certain areas, but at the end of the day, each guy, because it's a do-or-die business, most of these guys are on 1 or 2 year contracts, each guy has biases, just like I do, just like Cam does, just like our other assistant GM, Steve, does, just like our director of hockey analytics, Brian McDonald, does. We all have these biases, so we have to be aware of them, right? So why do we use data, right? Well, everyone's entitled to their own opinion, and there's plenty in our draft room and our trade deadline room, but not everyone's entitled to their own facts. So how do we verify which facts are correct and which facts aren't? And that's something that we try to do pretty regularly to figure out what inputs actually lead us closer to the truth, or in certain situations, help reduce the risk and be better predictors of future performance. And so because we're the West Point Panthers, I'm sure you guys have seen some reports. Here's our scout on the left today. He's getting the job done. He's got his little pencil, he's got his rifle, he's out there, he's trying to find out who the best player is, and that's what we're trying to go to on the right? We want a guy with more information, better inputs, who works smarter, who can see the players that we actually need to know the most about. So, given all that, I think one of the things that we do pretty regularly, and this isn't really a philosophy, it's sort of our operating manual. One of the things we do pretty regularly is, how do we want to play the game to win? The NHL is one of the hardest leagues to win games in. Obviously, you see our division, is separated by about 6 points to 8 points. 6 teams have a shot to make the playoffs. So it's an incredibly hard league to win games in. So what is it that we need to do? How do we construct our roster today, tomorrow, and 5 years from now to be competitive? And the variables that go into that are, innumerable, and you can't really measure all of them exactly, but we need to have a certain methodology that we're trying to approach the game with. So then we go into who on our roster fits, right? So who is a player that we can build around? Who's a guy that we think we can train, either a young kid or maybe an old guy that's come in and he's on a contract here, et cetera, et cetera. And then who are the guys that don't fit anymore, and how do we gain value for those players? And then how we build the team really is, and why the draft is highlighted, is through the draft. If you looked at the most successful teams in the past 10 years in the NHL, the core of their team primarily is built through the draft. Also, that impacts their business model, right? You want the best players for the lowest amount of money. You find those guys in the draft. And then you either trade for guys or you have free agents, and we talk about those scenarios all the time as well. And then that leads into the development of our players with our development staff and our minor league team in Springfield. And then that feeds into how we play the game, right? So that's a continuous cycle that we use. But most important for us, because we're a Florida-based team, because we're a non-traditional market, and because it's really hard to draw fans into our building, we need to find the absolute best players for the lowest cost possible. And so it's important for us, as we go through the NHL entry draft, that we find players who we think can play for our team in every single round, which is a hard thing to do. And we try to do that realistically. If we get 3 to 5 guys per draft year, that can either help us or we can use as an asset in a trade scenario. Then that's value add to our organization. So it's an incredible task that we ask our scouts to do. And so part of how we help our scouts become more efficient is, through what Cam does with some other draft consultants, and I'll let him talk on the model. But essentially, what we're trying to do is arm our scouts with smarter information, with data that helps them work more efficiently. Cam?
Thanks, Eric.
Anytime.
So I'm part of a group of 3 of us. There's also myself, Reese Jessup, and Josh Weisbach, and in the part of the amateur scouting analytics group. So we started writing for a couple different publications. Well, I guess blogs is probably the correct term. But back in the 2013 through 15 period of time, and really what we were trying to do is just ask really interesting hockey questions around prospects and scouting. So it was questions like, if a defenseman scores a lot of points in junior, does that mean he has a higher likelihood of being a successful NHLer? Or, does size matter? And if so, how much weight do we want to put into it? Or, if a kid is 18 years old, but he's earned a roster spot in European elite leagues, playing with men, does that mean that he's got a higher likelihood of success? So we started to ask all of these really interesting questions, and then we, over time, started to kind of piece it together. And I think the 2 pieces that we worked on, either independently or collaboratively, that got a lot of press. One was affectionately referred to as the Sham-Sharon project that Reese and Josh did. And really what they did was basically use some very simple data along with CSS scouting data and kind of compared the results versus how teams performed. And I think a lot of people found that really interesting, but the piece of that people kind of missed was the secret sauce there wasn't that we built they built a really cool model. It was that when you put scouting and stats together, you end up with a better outcome than either individually. And that's a philosophy and a mandate that we've seen reproduced multiple times in our own work since working with the Panthers, as well as in the public space time and time again. So I think from, Eric talked about what our mandate and our process is, but what we really look into from an amateur scouting side is building a high-performing team with scouts and analytics working together, and with that view of we can make a better outcome when we combine our talents as best we can. And then the other one that we got a lot of pressed for was we called prospect cohort success percentages, which is basically taking all the independent variables across all these different leagues and using that to build a database where we can say any particular prospect, we could look at the players that performed most similarly to him, had various characteristics that were very close to that given player, and then use that data set to learn about where we think that player's outcomes can be. So these are kind of the historical things that we kind of built before working with the players that kind of builds a little bit of a baseline for us going forward. But again, the big thing here was our work was around asking interesting hockey questions. So this allows us to ask interesting hockey questions when we're in the room together. So if a defenseman scores at a really high rate, we'll ask, okay, well, the scouts, well, what this means is he's getting a lot of ice time. He's probably a really good passer. If he's scoring a lot of goals, he's probably got a good shot. Now, how does that align with what you're seeing? How can you fill in the rest of the context so we can understand this player better? So again, our guiding philosophy as a team is that stats and scouts, when working together, can outperform either discipline individually. And I think that when your starting point is that as your baseline, it facilitates a group of like teamwork and collaboration and a fair amount of mutual respect in an environment where we're going to work together well as a team and learn from each other. So in terms of our mandate, like as you would expect on the analytics scouting side, our focus, of course, is to try to build the best-in-class tools for the Panthers. And I think we do a pretty good job of that. But more importantly, we'll work with these guys from the off-season all the way through. So as the tools are flagging guys that are performing well, it's a scoping exercise. We'll say, well, these guys look like pretty good from the data, so you can help them inform who they're going to go see. So like remember, in this industry, a scout may see 200 games in a year, and because players are humans and scouts are humans, you could very easily see one or two bad games from a guy earlier in the season, and that's going to color how you expect that player's future performance to be. However, when we're seeing guys flagged repeatedly in the data, we can say, well, maybe give him another shot. Maybe you should, check this out again. And that may flag a guy that could be a keeper who they may have just written off earlier in the season because of poor play in that small sample of games that they're reviewing. And conversely, there may be attributes that a scout may say, well, this guy's going to definitely be a player, but we'll have to ask ourselves, okay, well, all of these attributes of the player that you value very highly, how come they're not showing up in our data? And that actually opens the door to a very, very fascinating conversation in the room, because a lot of times that's where we learn, both from each other and in a lot of cases, those dialogues have actually driven R&D findings that have given us new tools. We have 3 or 4 new research areas that have come directly from those type of discussions with our scouts, which is exactly the type of teamwork and model that we want to build within the Panthers organization. And then, down the list, of course, what you're going to expect, who obviously focus a lot on statistical analysis for players, as you expect we would, but that's really all focused on driving good communication and collaboration with the other members of the scouting team. So we're going into our second draft together. So this is a fairly new model, and I think we've had a lot of really good learnings, and quite frankly, I think we've built a pretty high-performing team together, which is pretty interesting from the fact of the Reese, Josh, and myself obviously come from very different backgrounds than guys that have been in the business for 30 years. So, but how can we bring all those different skills that we bring to the table and work effectively together? And of course, this is all discussion around culture, communication, mutual respect. But beyond that, and we don't see this in the discourse in hockey analytics online as much, but we have a lot of humility in terms of the data that we bring to the table. We realize that there's limitations, and we have to be careful of not overstating the implications of the data that we bring. And I think that it's easy online to say, well, my model says this player is great, and you say he's bad, therefore you're dumb. And then you see that play out online all the time. But for us, it's my model suggesting this. You have a different point of view. What am I missing? It's like puzzle pieces. You'll have a certain amount of statistical puzzle pieces, but that's not the entire picture of a player. What more can you bring to fill in the context, make it a more clear picture? Because we're making multi-million-dollar decisions with Eric here. So I think it's that type of culture and teamwork that helps us be successful. And anyway, so the last point is the big one for us. When we get in the room, people expect that a scout with 30 years of experience and a computer boy may have vastly different opinions, and that is absolutely not the case. 80% of the time, we are completely in alignment with each other, and the other 20% of the time is when we have really good conversations, and that's when we start to learn and grow together. So this is a little bit too kumbaya of a presentation, but that's...
No, there are debates. There are great debates.
But anyway, that's how we try to solve the problem with the forward Panthers to build a competitive advantage in scouting. And anyway, the last slide that we have here is, we acknowledge we have a learning curve here. We've learned a lot in the last year and a half together. I have no doubt that we are smarter today than we were yesterday, but we're actually going to be a lot smarter tomorrow than we are today. So it's been a fun ride, although the drop-off is steep. Anyway, over to my main man for Q&A.
No, I mean, it's a steep learning curve. I'll give you guys a story, right? It's a Q&A answer, but I'll color with this, right? We have a first-round pick last year, number 23. We selected from the Finnish Junior A League, Henrik Borgström. And Henrik Borgström's profile in PCS was 0%. So he was a 0% guy. Based on the league he was playing in, and he was an overage who grew 6 inches, and all of a sudden our Finnish scout who has a lot of cachet in our organization, he's the guy who said you should select Sasha Barkov, who's a pretty good player, stepped up and said, honestly, I look at the 3 Finns, you have Laine with the big shot, you have Puljärvi with a lot of skill, and I think this kid Borgström is as skilled as both of these guys. He doesn't have as big a shot as Laine, but I think he could be Puljärvi-like, and you're talking about guys who are going to go, potentially 1-2 overall. And so it presented the Florida Panthers management team with a decision, right? So now we have the statistical model saying one thing, and the scouts are diametrically opposed. And ultimately, we decided to go with, the recommendation of our Finnish scout. We're pretty happy with our selection. He's playing at the University of Denver right now, and he's doing really well, so we hope he's a large piece of our future going forward. But that's just one of the many debates. The flip side of that is, we took kids who were 60 on our draft list, 70, and moved them all the way up to potential first round players. And part of the reason that we traded some of the guys we did to get extra picks was to really to see if this model worked and select some of those guys as well. We're happy with their play right now as well. So, it's really interesting when you try to mash it all up. We're essentially trying to limit the risk, right? Multi-million-dollar decisions. We're trying to make sure that we look at every input. Our model is ever evolving, but nothing is an end in of itself. They're just inputs into the decision-making process. So, but we do have, hockey is a very subjectively evaluated game. One of the things, our owner owns a high-frequency trading firm, right? So he's all about data. That's why he's a billionaire, right? He literally owns his firm, and it trades back and forth, and he has computer models for every sort of market that's out there, and he executes millions of trades a day, and he makes a couple pennies per trade, and literally I think the firm's been in business now over 700 days and has lost money one day. So he's all about data. But he came to us the other day and said, hey, I want to know gap analysis. I want you guys to look at the gap analysis of our defensemen to see if it's a good gap, a bad gap. And I'm like, whoa, there's a lot of variables that go into that. Like where's the puck? Where's your F3? Where's your far side, near side support? What's the speed of the players? Who are the players coming? I mean, if Connor McDavid's coming at me, I'm going to have a pretty steep gap, right? So like there are all these different variables that go into, the one stat that he's trying to create. But in reality, what he's trying to do is not just say, this is interesting to me, I want this information in a finite system. He's saying, I want to push you guys to innovate. So let's try to get better at what we always say in whatever war room we're in is adding value at the margins, right? Let's get better at figuring out who we are. Let's get better at figuring out who the other teams are, and then try to plan around that. So with that, we'll take your questions. Yeah.
From a performance analytics standpoint, do you think hockey is at a disadvantage or has a challenge in comparison to other sports, given the fact that the average shift on the ice is only 45 seconds?
Can you just define what you mean by performance analytics? Like what you're
Being able to collect the data on how the players perform when they're on the ice.
like acceleration and heart rate and things like that? No, I think it can be done. Some teams do it in the American Hockey League, I know for sure. And I've never seen the end result or how that adds value other than to potentially predict injury. But hockey is an incredibly random and subjective sport, so your acceleration, it's hard to define really in any given shift what's appropriate versus what's not appropriate. You sort of just like the gap stat, I subjectively know, like I watch a play and I can say that's a good gap, that's a bad gap, but to measure that is hard because you have to mark certain variables. So, I mean, I don't know if it's at a disadvantage, but it just takes more effort, more work, etc.
That's a great question. This is how do you normalize for competition across leagues? Absolutely. So I think the thing that we learn in NHL, what we have to unlearn when we're looking at analytics outside of the NHL is that we've gotten used to a lot of parity in the NHL. Like there's a lot of consistency. There's not a lot of difference between teams. Whereas you can play in junior in the Ontario League, and a guy could be playing with a team that scores 2 goals a game, another guy could be on a team that scores 5 goals a game. So we have to look at those variables, look at like the team scoring balance, look at who they're playing with. The line mate impact is a huge impact, and then of course applying that across the leagues as well. So we'll look in Europe, for example, and an 18-year-old. Maybe playing only 5 minutes a night, but be a great player because he's playing 4th line on a men's team in the SHL. So all of these factors have to get baked into our decision-making process. And as those of you that follow the space pretty well, we've realized we've come a long way in terms of the data that's available at the NHL level, but the ability to generate that data outside of the NHL is a lot more tricky. So quite frankly, that's a lot. We've done a really good job aggregating what we think is probably the best-in-class database that kind of track a lot of this stuff. But beyond that, this is where the discussions with our scouts become so important. There could be a guy that's playing down the lineup on, for example, the London Knights, and he may be an amazing prospect, but he's going to play down in the lineup because that team is so good year in, year out. So again, this is why the collaboration is really key.
Just want to know, how are you guys factoring sort of the mental side of performance when you're going and playing?
That's a great question because that's really, I tell the players, I'm GM of the minor league team as well, and the only speech I give my players at the beginning of the year, really the only time I talk to them, is I say you control 2 things. You control your attitude and your preparation, and that is both physical, it's emotional, and it's most certainly mental, right? Especially playing in Springfield, you got to be mentally tough. We obviously the combine gives us a snapshot of a player, but those guys are normally highly coached when they go in there. what we've started to do, and again, this whole presentation was about know yourself. So not only our scouting staff, really it's about training the scouting staff and training ourselves to, when we interact with these kids, to ask the most appropriate questions. So we have consultants that come in and give classes to our scouting staff on how to collect intel, right? And they try to normalize the collection. Part of what happens is, when I first got here, is the scouts would ask random questions to random kids to try to make them feel comfortable, and they get a sort of a picture of how funny the kid is or what type of personality he has. So now we've done away with that, and we ask the same question to every kid, so we can now compare kids across the full spectrum, right? And when they're out collecting data at games, every interaction they have with a kid is an opportunity for them to assess sort of his mental state. And we specifically tell them not to go to just the big games, but to go to, the 3-3 if you're in the American Hockey League on a Sunday to see what a kid's attitude is like, or, the back-to-back against a bad team, because some guys rise up competition against good teams and kind of fall off against bad teams. But we want guys who compete consistently, control their attitude and their preparation, and really want to win at all costs. So, it's a great question. We're, I think, at the nascent stages of sort of executing what I think is a pretty interesting plan. And again, this whole presentation today was all about your mental aptitude as management and scouting to assess kids for that stuff. So.
When you're looking at historical data from the peers, how are you accounting for changes to how the game is being played and over like a 10-year period? It's obviously being played differently. Equipment changes, strategy, stuff like that.
Yeah, not to get into too much of the how we do that, but I think in the space there's been a lot of good work done on how to adjust appropriately for era, scoring in different eras. So I'll leave it at that.
So after you guys have drafted a player, what kind of analytics are you guys using to determine which route you want to push them, whether or not that's Canadian Hockey League or college, Europe? Because there's vast differences between the leagues.
Well, normally when we draft a guy, he comes from one of those leagues, unless he's a kid who we take from, say, the USHL, and then he might have an opportunity to play Canadian Junior or NCAA. There are different rules associated with when you can put kids in your minor league system with each league. But normally we let the kids decide. Again, these are 18-year-old impressionable kids. What we try to do is, if they feel they should go play one place or another, we may say, hey, look, Bjorkstrom's an example where being in college, he needs to gain weight and strength. You can do that in college. You only play 35 games. You have great facilities usually at your disposal. And if you're playing major junior, you have to play, an NHL-type schedule on buses. You're not eating as well, but you get used to the grind, right? So there's pros and cons to each, but really it comes down to the kid saying, my whole life I wanted to play for the Maine Black Bears. And we say, God bless you, have fun, and we'll let you know when we think you're ready. But that doesn't mean you think you're ready either. So we really try to not put it on the kid, but be a support system for that player in any scenario that he thinks will help his career. And if he wants to transition from one to the other, that's fine too, and we'll figure out a way to do that where he could be in the best possible situation for him.
Have you guys looked at relative age effects? And if so, how are you measuring it?
Yeah, so sort of the question on era scoring, there's been relative age effect has been kind of well documented in the public space, and that definitely, that's something that you need to account for in your models as well. Yeah.
You mentioned how when you guys were picking your first round draft pick, the stats said one guy and the scout said another guy, and you guys ended up going with the scout's opinion. What do you think that says about how management views the statistical side of it?
I can't speak on 30 other teams. I can tell you in our team, I can tell you in our team, everything that a scout says or everything that a number says or everything that a report says is an input into a process, right? So we're not we're not outcome-based, we're process-based, and therefore we look at and weigh all the different inputs that we can the mental side of it as well. We have our draft reports, we have our play reports, but sometimes we flag kids because they have characteristics that don't fit, right? So when we talk about adding a player to our system, it's always cash, cap, contract, opportunity cost, and fit, right? And everything to that, whether it's an NHL player, an AHL player, or an amateur player, is an input, and we weigh those relatively 50-50, I would say. I don't think there's any one winner or loser, and then we just say, hey, this is based on what we're hearing, we think we can maximize efficiency and minimize risk doing X.
So I think that one is a fascinating one because quite frankly, the dialogue around that particular pick, since Eric brought it up, was great because what we had said is his profile as a guy that was undrafted the year before, playing in Finnish Junior versus Liga, all of these different variables, doesn't historically, that success rate isn't as high as some other guys are on the board, but that dialogue, again, to trust the process, that dialogue just brought up like an amazing conversation in the room. And when you're having these conversations, what really happens is the guys that are marginal kind of fall by the wayside, but what you're left with is the guys that you have the scouts are most impassioned by, good and bad. So, we were left with a guy that our scouts would absolutely go to the mat for. And, our role is saying, here's the flags, weigh it appropriately. And, I think that process enables us to make the best decisions. So yeah, I think that was one that, after the day, we're all really happy with it, and obviously we're happy with now. I'd prefer to have the space to myself. No, I mean, I think there's an amazing amount of good work that's done at the NHL level. I think when you look at the importance of the draft to building championship teams, I sort of think it is underserved. And I think, I think we're doing, a lot of good work in the space.
Is Vinny? Yeah. Viola? Yes. As far as I can tell.
We're still here.
I may not be here if he's not, but no, I think I think Vinny is a believer in data, and he's a believer in process because he's been successful in multiple other businesses using the most efficient process that he can find. It's a situation that I know Vinny's going to own the team in 10 years, and I hope I still work for him. So if I do, that means the process worked. But he's committed.
So unfortunately, yeah, that's all the time we have. There is a hockey panel later at 12:45 for those who are interested, so feel free to come to that. And thank you all for coming.